Alexander Kolokotronis. I'm a third-year PhD student here in political science. Prior to coming to Yale, I was a worker co-op development assistant in New York City. Worked in a lot of startup development, and then also with New York City network of worker cooperatives, was getting more into conversions and so forth. Here at Yale, I study teacher-run public schools, so still in the area of cooperatives, and New Haven's actually largely a site I've been looking at. With that said, I'm really excited to have both of our speakers or lead conversationalists, depending on how we're talking with this and how this goes. We have Kristen Barker, who's co-founder and executive director of the Cincinnati Union Cooperative Initiative. And then we have Kali Akuno, who's also a co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson. As we talk, or as they give sort of their overviews of their organizations and their respective stories, we're really encouraged that you think of questions, whether for our own context or beyond, regarding cooperatives and specifically how we can maybe see this happen in Connecticut or in the greater New Haven area. So I'm not sure who'd like to go first, but basically like a general overview of what your organization does, what projects you've been working on, other elements you might think are important to telling your story.
Yeah, okay, ladies first. So I think both of us are really excited to be here today and hope that this conversation can help catalyze all the interesting things that are happening in New Haven. So I look forward to the question part and hearing about the existing things and hoping that whatever Kali and I are bringing today can help catalyze that even further and support what's happening here. So just an overview. Like you said, I'm one of the founders of Cincinnati Union Co-op Initiative, also the national network, which is oneworker.onevote.org, which is a network of union co-op networks around the country. And so we came into existence in Cincinnati as a result of Mondragon's historic partnership with the steelworkers. Who knows Mondragon? Okay, a few of you. So what is remarkable about Mondragon is it's in the Basque region of Spain, and that alone is not what makes it remarkable. But it's an incredible model that actually shifted an entire region that after the Spanish Civil War was experienced extraordinary levels of poverty, of unemployment to the tune of, say, 70%. And within about 20 years of creating this integrated network of co-ops, so hear that, not one-offs, this integrated network, this family of co-ops, they got to nearly full employment. Now they've been around for over 60 years. And when Spain, at least when I was there again a year and a half ago, had unemployment levels of 20%, this part of Spain had a 4.2% level of unemployment. So extremely resilient model, very powerful. What I really want to see in Cincinnati throughout the world, really. And I mean, that's absolutely it. We have a sign in our office that says, how do you create an economy that works for all, especially those who have been historically excluded? And what I think about Mondragon is they kind of show a proven path to that. And some of the characteristics of that path that I think are really emulatable, and that may or may not be a word, who knows, but you get my point. So anyway, that are really matter, I think, is this ecosystem approach, this family of co-ops, not a one-off co-op, but instead a very interconnected network that can support each other during downturns in the economy, which are always going to happen. So Mondragon, there's over 70,000 people employed in their worker-owned co-ops. They have their own school, their university that's run by the teachers. It's a multi-stakeholder co-op, so it's run by the teachers and staff. It's run by the students and the other co-ops in the network. So that's their governance structure. They have their own bank. And then they have advanced manufacturing. They have their grocery chain. It's just a very multi-sectoral kind of a deal. So no one sector is in trouble all of the time. So they create these incredible solidarity mechanisms. 10% of their profit goes into the larger whole. And that's democratically decided where that goes. Does that go to help new co-ops start? Does that go to rainy day funds? Does it go into their social security system above and beyond what Spain offers? they make these decisions together. It's awesome. But beyond that particular thing, the level of solidarity that's represented in the system involves even worker shifting. So when there's a downturn and some of the worker owners need to be let go, other co-ops, there's an agreement to take them on and cross-train them and help them continue to have a job. So it's it's a real deep level of solidarity. So I think those sorts of things, thinking about the level of solidarity needed to have this kind of a change, which is completely what I want to see in Cincinnati. I want thriving communities. Our child poverty level is 52%. Absolutely outrageous. We also have an incredible concentration of Fortune 500s. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, you know? So I want an economy that works for all. And so what I think some of what we learned from Mondragon is this interconnected, this family, this ecosystem, this deep level of solidarity. How do we cultivate that? How do we build a response? How do we build an ecosystem in Cincinnati that has that at the heart of it? That's one thing. Another thing in Mondragon, again, serious focus on education. They have beautiful cooperative principles. One of them is education. And that idea is they open admission, of course, so anyone can be a part of these co-ops if they have the ability to learn the job and they have the willingness and openness to this co-op model. Anyone can be a part of it. And when you have that kind of policy, as all of our co-ops do in Cincinnati, you happily attract a whole variety of people, many of whom haven't had access to very much formal training. And yet we're preparing these people to be business owners, and so they need to have a pretty high degree of business literacy, financial literacy. So how do you really focus on education? How do you, in super accessible ways, help people, learn these sorts of things and tap into those parts of themselves that may not have been explored yet? So we take a cue from Mondragon, and we have these team meetings every week where we're building business intelligence, we're doing problem solving, we're playing something called the Great Game of Business, which helps people understand in a fun way how they're contributing to the bottom line. We're doing communication, we're learning conflict styles. You also have to be able to get along and listen to differences of opinion, and so we spend a lot of time on building up those kinds of skills. All sorts of things related to solidarity, consciousness, and helping us realize how deeply interconnected we all are. We're a union co-op, which is what I'm about to get to. And so being a part of the larger labor movement is also critical to us, to not just being like a little co-op ecosystem among ourselves, but being part of this wider movement towards economic justice is absolutely critical. And it's not just the labor movement. We're tied into immigrant rights movement. We have a lot of immigrants involved. We are tied into all sorts of other movements, and that's we don't want to become too insular. We recognize that we're all in this together, basically. So back to one other thing about Mondragon that I think is really, really valuable. They created, in co-ops, in most co-ops in the United States, we have their structure is worker owners, they elect a board. And that board has the long-term vision of the co-op at its heart. And that board often selects the management team. But what Mondragon also has, and that's basically the structure of most co-ops in the US, but what Mondragon additionally created was this thing called a social council. And this is something that's somewhat akin to a labor union. It's a place where if the board has the long-term vision and the management is working to implement that on a day-to-day way, this is a space for dealing with all the human relations issues that come up, all the conflicts that naturally arise because we're humans. It it creates very clear pathways to make sure there's sufficient communication happening between management team and workers. Even though worker owners technically have the ability to take away, to actually vote out their supervisor, and they get to participate in this awesome General Assembly where they're looking deep and wide at all of these things, still things come up. And Mondragon's experience was when you get to 50 or more employees, there begins to be a bit of a disconnect between those on the shop floor and those at management. And there was actually a strike in the 70s in one of Mondragon's co-ops because there wasn't different decisions were being made without sufficient input. So they doubled down on this concept and they said, how do we have these redundant structures that help us live our values as fully as possible, make sure we have sufficient worker voice. And so now in all of Mondragon's co-ops, if they have 50 or more people, this is mandated, these social councils. They're voluntary before that time. But I think it's a really neat thing that can help co-ops here scale with values intact. This is a system that allows that to occur. So, all right, so those are things I think we can learn from Mondragon. I realize I can just go, can't I? So let me try to kind of wind things up because I am truly, as I started with, extraordinarily interested to hear what's happening here and answer questions that are the most relevant to you. So I'll just say this, that Cincinnati was the first group to bring this Mondragon United Steelworker vision into reality, and that vision really is this: you're creating this interconnected network. You are creating union co-ops, so you have the power of labor, which we see as really important for a lot of reasons. One is that the solidarity consciousness needed to make this network work, it can be found in the best practices of the labor movement. So that's one of them, but there's a lot of varieties of things. There's really nice health benefits too, that's cool. But all sorts of lovely things there. We've also been able to advocate on the Farm Bill and things because the United Food and Commercial Workers represents our first co-op, which is Our Harvest, which is a farm and food hub co-op that's been around for 7 years now. And interestingly, the UFCW approached us to ask, what would we like to see in the Farm Bill? It's like, oh, we got a lot of ideas. And just kind of how interesting that this itty bitty place in Cincinnati with 11 workers was able to have our voice represented by this more forceful kind of a group. So I think there's a variety of really interesting things that are there. But beyond that, so I would just say in our ecosystem in Cincinnati, we have a serious focus on education. So you see that we meet every week with all of our workers. We meet on the job site. We are really deeply building those types of financial intelligence, emotional intelligence really too, business intelligence. That's like a very concerted effort. We also meet with the CEOs or the head management folks to help problem solve each week. So there's a lot of support around this, a lot of investment in people. We have some existing co-ops. I mentioned Our Harvest. We have Sustainergy, which is a residential insulation and mold remediation co-op. That's a cool one. We have this thing called CareShare, and that one is represented by the Steelworkers. CareShare is actually represented by the Cincinnati Federation of Teachers, and it's actually in the space of childcare, and it's a cool one. Apple Street Market is this project we've been working on for years to put a full-service grocery store in a food desert. And we just had an awful setback. We were about to go to construction in March, and at the end of January, because we're using this thing called New Market Tax Credits to make this happen, because it's a $4.8 million project, PNC pulled out. They were a New Market Tax Credit investor. They pulled out at the end of January because they realized due to tax reform that they had overinvested in tax credits in 2018, so they were canceling their projects all across the U.S. And so now that was bringing $1.5 million of equity into our project. So we are now trying to raise all that. I mean, we had everything's ready, everything's been permitted. We're like, anyway, it's a bummer, but we're working on it. All right, so we have this immigrant co-op that's actually all these Guatemalan immigrants that is going to be launching in June, which is a cleaning co-op. We have something called Co-op U, which is this 12-week co-op boot camp that uses Mondragon's cooperative incubator, some of their best practices, along with lean startup, so it's really hands-on and iterative. That begins again on April 16th, and there's 5 local groups going through that. We also have a loan fund that we get to be a part of because there's this financial cooperative that exists across the country, and we're able to tap into that. We also have something called renting partnerships. I'm just throwing all this out there in case you want to ask questions about it. Renting partnerships is a really innovative way of doing affordable housing where people actually, this is a nonprofit that's a part of our group, not a co-op, but an innovative way of doing affordable housing where people actually build financial equity as well as deep levels of community in the process. And they have created right now a real estate investment co-op called Dividend Housing that is a way of reinvesting in disinvested communities in a way that doesn't lead to gentrification, because you can keep rents where they need to be for the majority of people in Cincinnati, which is people that make between 20 and 35,000. So it's a really, really cool kind of a thing. And the other thing that we focus on and are working with a number of companies of existing owners who are wanting to transition their business to their employees. So facilitating that process. Okay, two quick last things. We also have policy. We do a lot with different things on policy in our city, and we have some exciting policies that will benefit co-ops kind of underway at the moment. And I'm happy to talk about that. And finally, we have something that all of you are invited to in November 15th and 16th called the Union Co-op Symposium. And this is where groups of people who are already bringing this to life in their city or are considering bringing it to life come. We have a lovely group of people from Mondragon. We have all kinds of people that are doing this. It's a very practical, fun 2 days. So that's another little piece. Your turn.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Kali Akuno again with Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi. I guess a little bit about us before launching in to like a challenging pieces of some concepts I want to throw out, right, to hopefully stimulate a dialogue and maybe a debate in your community. So Cooperation Jackson is almost 5 years old. Will be 5 come May Day this year. And it's been a joyous and a tumultuous ride at the same time. But don't let the 5 years fool you, as some of us were talking last night. This is actually the result of about 40 years of work to really kind of lay a foundation in Jackson, Mississippi by some previous generations that led to this particular point in time. Because we don't want to give people the false impression that you're just going to like start something immediately, like in a vacuum. Not going to happen. So just be mindful of that. But even more specifically, there was roughly about 10 years of concentrated study and development around looking at that co-op development all over the world for both positive and negatives before we even got to a point of launching Cooperation Jackson. And in many respects, our launch was actually somewhat premature. In that the plan that we had laid out, and you can read elements of this plan, it's called the Jackson Cush Plan, which we kind of put out publicly roughly in 2012, but we started talking about it roughly about 2008. And that plan has kind of like 3 components of like building power in a very concentrated way to do some very deliberate things politically and economically. So one is building people's assemblies as like an instrument of broad kind of constituent-based people's power being kind of the leading engine driving this. The second was what we call independent political politics, electoral politics, coming and being directed from this people's assembly. And then the third one, which is the area in which we fit in, was trying to build a very active and dynamic solidarity economy, primarily on a municipal level. And that was for some very specific reasons in our context, which I'll try to contrast in a minute. What I understand, and folks can correct me, the difference between our context in Mississippi and here, because there's some similarities, but then there's also some profound differences. And then how do you relate to that, I think, winds up being a key question to look at, right? So over the course of this 5 years, where we have kind of concrete landed after a bunch of good starts, failures, some good starts, and things continue to move forward. There's a urban farming cooperative called Freedom Farms. There's a lawn care cooperative called the Green Team. There's our newly opened community production co-op, which is a small scale digital fabrication factory, if you would. That's kind of emerging, developing. And then we have a ever-growing land trust. And for us, the land trust is really, in many respects, the driving force, the economic engine, the foundation for us. And what we very intentionally and strategically tried to do was to occupy as much land as possible in our community and to take it off of the speculative market. Because gentrification is coming, is being driven primarily by an expanding medical corridor, a process that got set in motion shortly after Hurricane Katrina, when our governor, Haley Barbour, really kind of looked at the model of what was going on in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina as being a kind of a major economic engine, but also a way to reorganize your city, right? And so in New Orleans, that's been used as a major source of cleansing the city of large sectors of its black working class to create a new city. And that was by design, and it's also by design in our case, right? So for us, we started with this kind of imperative of like the broader political project of which we are part of is really dependent upon certain demographic factors that we think are both in our favor, at least to kind of try the vision that we have. So what I mean by that, Jackson is 80% black, right? It's roughly 200,000 people. It's a deeply impoverished city. Roughly 40% of the city is at or below the poverty, the noted poverty line in the city, and unemployment is more than rampant. And what that, into the reverse of that, is what that enables is folks very hungry for change outside of the box, right? And exploration and wanting to try new ideas, because clearly the standard way of doing things is not working and you don't have to convince anybody of that. It's more a question of, okay, what can work given the resources that we have and given the skills levels that we have. And that is where we try to come in and say, given our history and given our locality, nobody's coming to save us at this point. So what can we do? Look at each other, stare at each other in the face. What can we do to transform the situation given our own energy, will, and resources, right? And that is where this component of the solidarity economy and why we studied it became so imperative, because a large part of it, particularly I think in Mondragon, the deeper part of the context is them not only kind of emerging after the Civil War, it was really emerging in the backdrop of a fascist dictatorship. Right. A very repressive fascist dictatorship, and how do you organize, to bring employment in that context when clearly Franco made it known, I'm not supporting you in any way. If you all die, I don't really care. And so folks had to be, okay, we have to buckle down, bear down, and figure out a way to survive and eventually to thrive, utilizing our own energy and skills and talents. That's something we've drawn from very, particularly in hardcore in our case, trying to understand how do you make it in Mississippi. And so let me move to that area of what I think is different and then what's similar. I'll start with what I think is similar, and this comes from one of the papers that the little sheet did for the invite. And so one of the things that really caught my attention within that is that it was very clear that New Haven kind of sits at a crossroads, right? Basically between New York City, the behemoth, and the little behemoth of Boston, right? And so it's like a little vein between those two major arteries. So it kind of occupies a major kind of transit point. Jackson is the same way, not to the same extent, but it's also situated, and the reason that it exists primarily is to be a transport hub. Like fundamentally, that is what Jackson is. And if you look at it just from a geographical place, what is a transit hub to? North and south, if you follow that line, it takes you from New Orleans to Chicago. East to west, or west to east, It takes you from Atlanta to Dallas, Fort Worth. So we're just one of these little transit points of goods and services moving up and down. We also have the benefit of being not that far from the Mississippi River, right? Which was going back the old way. But if you look at the way the infrastructure is, there's the 55 and the 20, and then there's all the transit points. So Jackson is primarily developed in the midst of Mississippi of being a way of how do you take agricultural goods produced in the Mississippi countryside, bring them into a central processing place, and then moving them out. Like that is this kind of primary economic function, which is very limited. Because Mississippi was going back to how it was set up, like it was an extractive economy from the beginning and never was intended to be almost anything else. And that fundamentally has not changed in the 200 years it's existed. What do I mean by that? You set up these large plantations to produce these monocrops, right? In our case, primarily cotton. You don't develop any other industries, in regards to services or education in any major way. If your main thing is, let me work these folks as hard as I can work them, get the most I can get out of it, and then ship it elsewhere, because it's not refined and it's not even used locally, right? That's not the articulation of the economy then or now. So for us, we are in this kind of unique position of how do we reverse that tide of everything being taken out of here, right? And keep the resources here and then figure out how to develop them internally to build up the overall kind of service economy, caring economy that we really need. And so the piece I want to put out as kind of a challenge is I want us to really, like from our particular history we have to look at in our context, a lot of pushback on this notion of development. Like development for what? Development for whom and how? And like, how do we do this in a way that whatever is produced serves people, particularly those who've been excluded from any benefits for the most part? And then how do you do it in a way that is actually going to regenerate the bounty of the earth so that future generations can live, as opposed to continuing to deplete the soil, further the path to climate change in the sixth extension. We're not interested in that. So how do we make a contribution to reversing that? And I think that's a deeper question that we all have to look at in terms of dealing with this issue of kind of, development. The critical piece is, to me, is the inclusion, right? Is the inclusion. And I always push back on this notion that we have to produce more to be more inclusive. I think that that's an absolute lie. The system we have already produces a tremendous amount of waste. Like, we produce enough that everyone can live and live well, particularly in this country. So it's more of a question of distribution and equity than it is actually one of producing more goods and more services, right? And so it's a different political equation. It's a different way of looking at it. What can we do to make sure that people are being put in context so they can do more, what I would call, using old school language, self-actualized lives, which may not require us all working ourselves to death, which is presently how the system is organized. So it could be redistributing the labor in such a way that we don't have to work 40-hour weeks, but we can work 30-hour weeks or 20-hour weeks. And it's not like necessarily the productivity would go down. So really, I think we need to shift this question, and this is a piece that we're starting to do in Cooperation Jackson. Let me tell you how we got here, and then end and open it up. How we got here was about a year ago. We did like a serious analysis of saying, if everything that we envisioned, if it came true, how many jobs would it produce? And we came up that if every single idea that we had was done at a maximum, we would only produce 20,000 jobs. That would probably be the most, 20,000 jobs. The actual concrete need is probably for about 100,000. So we would still be well short of kind of beating the need for a job. But the need for a job and the need for resources and services is two different things. So we started to change the equation a bit. How do we improve the quality of life not necessarily focus on how many jobs that we can produce. And that is leading us in a different direction of saying, we don't have to, we have to kind of enhance the productive forces in Jackson, true, but that does not mean that you will be working 40 hours a week. Or any of those work owners would have to work 40 hours a week. They may work 20, and then we can kind of distribute that out. And then it's a question of how do we distribute the goods in an equitable manner within the kind of the capitalist limitations of having to make a profit, et cetera, that we presently live under. So you got that kind of district that you still have to deal with and manage. But I think we're trying to shift this question like very profoundly of saying, there's no way that we can actually meet the job necessity in the way that we've looked at and jobs have been organized to this point. Maybe we need to change the frame of reference in the game overall and figure out how do we provide better services. And I'm not meaning things that people don't work to actually create. Don't get me wrong in the sense of what I mean by services, but like how do we create the case like in my need. I would like for my kids, I would like to be around for my kids more. So I'd like to work 20 hours a week and then be able to give them 60 hours a week of my time. Or to create it in such a way that someone else could provide them with learning another language, learning particular skills. How do we organize that along solidarity lines so that all of us can enhance our time and not, be stressed out over where we're going to get childcare, where we're going to do X, Y, and Z. So it's not just like an abstract question. Why is it becoming a very practical question of how do you actually improve our lives so that we can all be healthy, more secure, live longer, live in better kind of conditions. So these are kind of questions I want to put out to you as you're thinking about, where New Haven is kind of situated, what resources it presently has, and how can those resources be reorganized in a particular way to meet human need more so than, look at it or how we're going to do this to kind of grow the economy. Two different ways of coming at a question of what is needed in this community, particularly to be more inclusive and to be more equitable.
Great.
Nice. Yeah.
So we'd like to open it up. Questions? Yes.
Well, so I tried to do cooperative organizing here in New Haven a long time ago, and I have to admit I quit, I gave up. And here's the reasons why. One is that I couldn't find, so I knew a lot of people that wanted to do some kind of business or, their own economic development, but at the time especially, everybody wanted to have their own business. It was like part of their identity thing. And the other thing was, it was hard to really get a core group. I mean, there was a little core group, but it was hard to get a core group that grew and kept adding people. So there were just like a little handful of people that kept talking to each other about it. And so I'm really interested in the early days of how you both got started in your respective places, and what were the early meetings like, and how did you grow it?
Sure.
And where did education come in, and how did that work?
Yeah. Either one? Do you want to go first? Okay. So I don't know if you all heard her, but she's interested in the early days. How did education happen? She's been involved in cooperative organizing here, and she gave up, she said, after a while because there was such a focus on people that wanted their own business as their own thing and not so much the shared entrepreneurship, and that the group didn't seem to grow that much. A similar group of people was talking. So in the case in Cincinnati, we, the 4 co-founders, all are community organizers. So like I was a community organizer, there's a labor organizer that was a part of it, someone else super involved in the labor movement, someone that was an immigrant rights organizer, and we spent a year really truly trying to study the Mondragon system as much as possible, what was happening in worker ownership, to sort of convince ourselves, to see if we were going to be convinced that this was actually a good way to put into like our blood, sweat, and tears, And ultimately, after a year, we thought, okay, there's real potential here. We think there's real potential. And so what we did was we just reached out to the communities we were most connected to, which happened to be the labor communities in Cincinnati, some faith-based, and some community I guess, community groups maybe, those sorts of buckets. And we had an event that drew about 90 people to it. And we did it in such a way where we were sharing the story of Mondragon and highlighting some neat co-op things that were starting to happen in the US. And then we just really asked people, we said, we want to make this happen. There needs to be more of us to make this happen. We had people line up on an imaginary line, and we said, if you think Mondragon is super awesome, but not replicable here, go to this side. If you think it's cool, amazing, but you don't have any time at this time, you're overextended, go in the middle. And then if you think, wow, this is really worth putting our time into, go to the end. And then I interviewed people down the line. People could move. And by the end, there's just about 2 that didn't think it could happen. A healthy group in the middle. And then 35 people at the end who wanted to put their time and energy into it. And so we started meeting every week. We identified all the kinds of questions we really needed to explore together. We connected with the Mondragon delegate, the North American Mondragon delegate. We were deeply connected to the steel workers already. So we then just what he ended up telling us was, if you guys create a pre-feasibility of a project, if you do the initial work, then I'll start to come once a month to help you bring that to life. So we created organizing committees. We ended up with 3 ideas immediately that we created organizing committees around. So we were intentional in who we invited. So in addition to this 35 people that was working to bring this into being, it was all right, for our harvest, which was a food-oriented one, we needed to have the United Food and Commercial Workers as part of that. We wanted to have a person from Ag Extension. We wanted to have a person from our health department. We want, there was a group that met once a month when Michael would come in to help us, but then there was this core group that would do the nitty-gritty work to make it happen. And we had groups like that for our manufacturing, as well as for our one that was related to the construction industry. So it was thoughtful about who you bring in, how often you, the once a month, you tap into them for making the connections and things and keeping you on track. But then there's a working group that may be meeting a few times a week, to bring it forward, because it's really a ton of work. I have a child with special needs and then a single parent, and people would come to my house. There were years at 9 p.m. until midnight or so, every night. So anyway, because we all had full-time jobs and things like that, but I guess, I don't know, that in a little bit. But I will say this too, real intentional about who we were making sure, the board of CUCI, once we decided to form a nonprofit. So all of that was before we had a nonprofit, but once we did, it's how do we get all of those communities represented on our board that I have just described? How are we really thoughtful about that? And how do we keep maintaining lots of involvement and engagement from everyone? So, I don't know.
Ours, real briefly, was starting from a much larger group that was already in motion, which was the People's Assembly. Which during the late 2000s, there were hundreds of people that were actively involved, doing a variety of work. A lot of specialized campaigns in essence that people were taking on, with a central focus around moving a policy agenda through city councilman, then city councilman Chuck Wheeler movement before he became mayor. And out of that larger group, a subgroup really started to meet that would then focus in on doing cooperative development, and that is where Cooperation Jackson comes out. So it's a much larger group that already existed, and it said, let's focus in and hone in on something in particular. But in that regard, it's the same dynamics. It was a lot of veteran community organizers, some folks, including myself, who already had some experience, however limited, doing co-ops. That was like a bedrock and anchor to it. And then out of that, we devised a comprehensive strategy that fit in mold with what the overall group was doing and agreed and consented to. And that is what led us to the particular path of when I said we were born prematurely, the first thing that we really wanted to do was kind of create an enabling environment for co-ops. And for us, that meant really trying to change the policy framework that existed in Jackson. And so when we got Chokwe elected, one of the primary goals that he was going to do during that first term was us create these kind of enabling conditions. So we wanted to change the policy that would make it easier, more attractive and supportive for some of the existing businesses to convert to co-ops and for co-ops to emerge. Another piece was to make sure that there was going to be sufficient kind of, capital resources on a local level that folks can draw from, because that's very hard for black folks to get any access to loans and credit in our context, particularly working class black folks. And then the third piece was to make sure that we set up that there was adequate training on different levels for people to develop their skills. And with his passing, we weren't able to get all of that kind of put together. So we kind of had to move that out of the kind of government sector into Cooperation Jackson. So the vision was always to create something like Cooperation Jackson. We just hoped that it was going to be like in 2019, not in 2014 when we kind of launched after Chokwe died. Because the ideal thing was to set up and build up all the reserves, to have trained, potentially hundreds of people through that process before we kind of launched. But you would have had that kind of bigger protective shield in which to do it, to give us some coverage. And then, with us, we were thinking at that time we may be able to do some elements of an anchor strategy because we kind of had that protective cover. But without it, we knew it was probably not likely. And so we wound up, when he passed, very clearly like, we're not going to have that kind of protective cover. So it's strictly just a bottom-up way that we kind of have to do this. But I think the critical thing was just the different, and to your question, the different layers of how we started from a broader group that really focused in, but then stayed in connection and process with the larger social dynamic. And I think that's one thing about our case which may be hard to replicate, which is why I'm going into the detail of it. Because we've been very clear with folks, like, there is no cookie cutter way to do this. Mastering your own context is really the fundamental thing that folks have to dig into.
My name is Bernardo. I'm a member of IWW here in Connecticut, labor union. And so one of the things I was wondering about was, and this is for both of y'all, which is that I was curious how you all balance the work of just keeping these initiatives afloat, just like economically, with grappling with larger questions of, like, for example, are we trying to transform capitalism, or are we trying to abolish capitalism? And so I'm sorry, that's kind of one of those dreaded two-part questions, but
Kali loves this. You're playing right to him.
So yeah, that's what I was wondering.
I'm personally trying to abolish it. Tomorrow.
Not today.
Yeah.
Tomorrow.
Well, I'm up right now, so yeah. I mean, I think it is a challenge. Like, how do you build towards the end, and be mindful of that at every single point? And then how do you break, and I mean that literally, how do you break the socialization that we all have? I'll use myself as an example of this. I keep a log of kind of discoveries about myself, about where capitalism has influenced my thinking. Like, when it's uncovered to me, like, that's a capitalist reaction. Like, why would you think that way? Why, like, where does that come from? But there's aspects of the logic of the system which are deeply pervasive that I don't think we take into account, like how much of the system is in us, not just outside, like how much of it is in us, in our, how we think, why we think the way we think, the values that we have, what we value, like it's deeply embedded in us, after these 500 years of indoctrination, basically, that we have. And so trying to do that with other people is always a struggle. Even though we may think that we agree ideologically, politically, there's still a context of how do we interact in the context of this system, and like how we value each other's time. Like that's one of the things that comes up, like I'm on time every day, you're late every day, you know, like how is this helping the productivity? So that's, you know, immediately there's a conflict around time being of a particular value that we have been indoctrinated as opposed to like, how does the end goal of whatever task that we said, how does it get done? And how does it get done in a humane way? And so then we kind of confront, like there's the things that we want to do, and then there's the things that are kind of imposed upon us by the system itself in order to sustain this, right? And so get out of this is going to be much harder than I think than we believe it is, unfortunately. Because there's still, you know, like, what's the old word for it? The Taylorist notions is deeply embedded in all of us in particular ways around like time. I have it bad, I'm just telling you.
Yeah.
So like, you know, it's deeply embedded. And there's some aspects of it, well, can it be flipped? In what way can it be flipped? And in what way do I, you know, work with folks to build kind of an infrastructure, in our cases, what we're trying to aim at, that is, there's enough of it being a circular kind of economy that it protects itself, but it can also can shield itself from a larger composition of, for us kind of looking down the road of like, say, what Amazon and folks, entities like it are becoming and where the dynamic is becoming. Like, how do we get to the point where that we can shield ourselves from that, but do so in a manner which is eliminate some aspects of competition, because as long as we're competing, we're actually still upholding the system. That is something that this last 5 years has clearly drawn me to, and not so much on a global level, but even on the local level, because there's a lot of, you know, as we've grown, there's been a lot of, not a lot, but there's been other entrepreneurs who've kind of emerged and say, well, I see you guys have succeeded in it, let me do that without all the democratic practices. I want to do the same thing, but without all the democratic practices, which means I can do it more effectively and efficiently than you can, right? And so even the local dynamic has increased certain aspects that we have to then overcome in terms of be like, well, why are we competing when, you know, us kind of competing with each other only leaves a door open to a larger entity coming in, undercutting us because it operates at a larger scale than either of us can amass here on a local scale. So, I mean, the only way that I'll end with this, the only thing that I know that we have to do is continually struggle to hold each other accountable to a vision. That's the only thing that I think that we really can do, and sometimes that's very uncomfortable, like very, very uncomfortable, but I think it's leading with values is the critical way in which we do it, and that's even different than leading with politics.
Yeah. So I think in some ways I sidestep it a bit, like in this way. So it's sort of like this very value-driven. The way I view our work is it's about building the beloved community. And so for me, the beloved community is a place where resources are shared more equitably and every single person is valued. And so I kind of view everything we do in this context, and everything I've ever been a part of. Before this, I worked as an anti-war organizer, all kind of economic justice organizer, all sorts of policy things. Like, I've always had that kind of a lens, which is not the capitalist, like, obviously capitalism is extractive. I believe it's dying in front of us right now. I mean, I think that the situation, I don't know how long it's going to take. It might be a few hundred years of dying, but that it is.
If we have that long.
If we do have that long. So that's also a problem. Extinction sucks. But what I was just going to say, though, is that to me it's absolutely dying. Like the level of wealth inequality is clearly going to collapse on itself. I mean, the only reason it didn't collapse when FDR was around is we got the New Deal, which kind of put some little bit supports that allowed it to kind of continue, but it's not, I mean, unless we do something really big like that again, I mean, it is absolutely collapsing in our midst. And honestly, it might take a few hundred years and we might not be around to see it, but what I think is happening is that there's all of these different experiments about what can things be like. So there's all sorts of solidarity economy experiments that are occurring, and that in my mind, these are all things that are helping to create this beloved community, this vision that I hold like deeply in what I want to see. So what emerges as a result and how, I'm not entirely sure, but what I am very, very concerned, and possibly I'm pretty pragmatic maybe also, but is related to like inside all of our co-ops, and as we work, how do we create this solidarity consciousness wherein we are helping to reinforce that all of our destinies are tied together. How are we doing that? And we were super intentional about doing that every week. So we're also very intentional about how our democratic processes work, so that people start to get in their mind, like, this is my expectation. My expectation is this is how a workplace works, this is how a community council should work, this is how city government should work, this is, we want to build these skills, these expectations. Was it time?
No.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Okay, anyway, I get going. I am hard to stop, but I will.
So I hope this isn't too specific of a question, but I'm part of a group that's working on affordable housing issues here in New Haven, and we're facing the same kinds of things you are. And we've talked about a land trust. You said that was a really important part, but it wasn't cooperative, right? You said it was a nonprofit. Can you speak a little bit more about what you're doing there and how the kind of cooperative aspect of it is built into it, if it is?
It is. I mean, the thing that we have been very driven to do is to acquire as much land as possible, as soon as possible, while it's cheap, because we don't assume it's going to stay that way forever. And we've placed a high emphasis on that. I would say roughly over the past 5 years, more than 50% of if you were to say for every dollar we spent, roughly about 60% of it has gone on like acquiring land or developing land.
And this is Cooperative Jackson is doing this?
Yes, this is Cooperation Jackson is doing this. So it is the facilitative body of the land trust. And so all the property that Cooperation Jackson owns is in this land trust. And there's a section of our board, our nonprofit board, that is a part of the overall board which governs that land trust, right? Like what we do, what we're going to use it for. Like, is this going to be for housing, or is it going to be for farmland? Is it going to be for a solar farm? Like, those questions then kind of get administered primarily by that, but it's kind of also through a larger consultative process with folks in the community. Like what do you want to see and where you're at, which is becoming more of a challenge, though, actually, because there's a group of folks in the community who are becoming more organized, who have a different vision of what development in this community should look like. And so one of the things about where we're situated, which I didn't talk about, where most of our properties are basically within a square mile radius of each other, like by design, so that it can be more concentrated in purpose. But we're literally a mile away from Jackson State University, and Jackson State University is a HBCU, but it's a HBCU which is very constantly and intentionally trying to become an urban university, not a black university. So it's starting to very intentionally attract a different student body and a different student base. They don't have enough housing for the growth that they've been going. There's been some pretty phenomenal growth the last 5 or 6 years, which I don't think is going to stop. And if they have it their way, it definitely won't stop. And so there's a group of black homeowners in our immediate community who want to take a lot of this vacant land and dilapidated housing, and they want to do student housing to exploit that coming and emerging market. Us, on the other hand, we have nothing against students, but we need a long-term stable community to build the solidarity consciousness, to build the solidarity economy. So we're kind of working at cross purposes, but they see profit, and for us, they're very clear with, like you guys are doing. We were at a community meeting, and they accused one of our folks here recently, like, you guys are trying to undermine the value of the community. And the person who was there didn't tackle that kind of head on. And so I remember we had an evaluation. I was like, next time, this is my opinion. I don't know, we didn't vote on it, so I don't know if it'll go that way. But my articulation of it was, next time we should say yes. Like, let's confront that head on. And let's start making that argument within the communities. Like, I'm not trying to, not to say I'm trying to lower your property value. That's ultimately not the case. But the issue is, we're trying to create a situation where all the working class, where everybody, not just, but all, this is a working class community, that's why I'm using it. But all these folks who live here can stay here and are not pushed out. And for us, our vision is to be able to take these kind of new innovative ways of producing housing cheaper, to create housing at a much lower pricing point that then the folks in our community can actually afford. And so there will be some part of it which will be individually owned, bought houses, but the vast majority of it, probably 60%, if we do it, if it works out the way we planned it, will be 60% of it will be cooperative housing. So, and the issue is, for us, we have to make it affordable, deeply, deeply affordable, so that the community that is there now can stay there and not be pushed someplace else. And in our case, roughly, about 60 to 65% of the people in our immediate community are renters, they're not homeowners. And the thing that we have, and why we did this, is that, but there's like, just in our immediate community, there's 10,000 vacant lots and or abandoned houses. So we've concentrated on buying those up and then trying to redevelop that and then put housing on it to increase the density, like over time, but to do it in such a way that the folks who are currently renting can actually own in one form or another, either through a cooperative or through their own, kind of individual piece. That we are open to both, but want to preference one. So for us, that's what we're trying to go. And again, it's so for us, going back to your question, is like a lot of our decisions, just so folks are clear, if you look at it purely from a market sense, they don't make any sense. And that's very intentional on our part. Like what is a greater value? The greater value and the greater objective is ensure that these poor black folks, our family, our relatives, our people, can stay here and over time be able to exercise enough political power to determine their own destiny. That is our ultimate goal and objective. And for us, that means within the larger context of what's going on, there's a politics of pushing folks out. We have to push a politics of, no, let's create the conditions that everybody can stay. If you want to stay, if you want to leave, that's your choice. But if you want to stay, here's the conditions are set up in a way that you can stay. And I think the one thing that there was, our state legislature is currently in session right now, and they'll be ending hopefully in a couple of weeks and stop this madness that they're doing. But they recently, because we kind of very quietly acquired a major piece of land on one of these major arteries in the city, 2 of these major gentrification plans that they had on the board, they literally just took off. They literally just took off, because it's like between ourselves and what we now own on this block and Stupot, which is a homeless service provider, they own a good portion of it. They've been trying to get rid of them for like 30 years. So between the 2 of us, we now have a controlling stake in literally like a critical 4-block radius. So it's like, unless they just do eminent domain, which they abolished because we talked about it. So they, a couple of years ago, using it as a strategy, unless they bring that back, they can't do anything. So it's like they literally have to take this stuff off the table. I was sitting there watching it, and it was like, this was one of the first times ever in my life I was like, finally, her decision had lasting impact.
That's awesome. That is awesome. I just want to briefly say renting partnerships is also a land trust.
Right.
I was just wondering, like, if you could just, this is also kind of specific, but just talk about some of the policies that you've pushed for at a local level that have kind of helped you get to the point that you are now, and maybe like a couple of those battles that, because you said, I know you were mentioning some policy work that your group was doing, and you also mentioned it but didn't get into the specifics.
We've kind of stepped back from policy work,
Okay.
actually. And the reason being, Mississippi is Republican-dominated state, but it's a libertarian, a radical, it's not your regular, there's some new Republican party. They're crazy, absolutely insane. So they are very much into the past 3 years into preventative policy. So like, you guys, some folks in our community, some of the labor unions were advancing a Fight for 15 campaign. They passed a law last year. No municipality can can determine its own kind of wage scale. We talked about doing some stuff around climate change, mitigation work and solar stuff. They passed a law last year. No, no municipality can do that like on its own. So we're kind of in this phase now. Let's stop talking. Yeah, let's shut up about what policies we want, and let's just do and ask for permission later. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah.
Not that we don't have ideas. We have a ton of ideas.
Yeah.
And in our context, our local city council is fairly progressive. They'll pass almost anything. But it's the question of, do we want to advance it in a way that they would then block it, which not only prohibits us from doing it, but prohibits other, municipalities from doing it. So we're kind of like, let's just shut up and move in a different direction now.
Awesome.
And when we started, there was no enabling policies at all. So like, it's only now. So I think our focus was just do stuff and then see, like now that there's a little bit more traction and people listen to us a little bit more, are there things that we can do? And so at this moment, there's a lot of willingness. Our city just conducted this study on the power of cooperatives for economic development. And especially related to the silver tsunami, that idea that baby boomers are retiring and they own 2/3 of our companies. So that, like, what role can cooperatives play in maintaining and stabilizing these businesses and neighborhoods as a result? And so we were just at a meeting a week ago where there's all of this desire to create, like, in addition to minority-owned business and women-owned business certifications that are prioritized in the procurement process, creating, even though at this moment all of our cooperatives are minority owned, it turns out, but like creating a certificate that's related to cooperatives kind of on their own, because in part, ownership is changing very frequently. So some of the certification processes, as more owners become part of it, are a little bit difficult. So that's one thing that they're very interested in doing right now. That could be a big deal. I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon, but when we have this, we're having cities come at our Union Co-op Symposium in November, which is the 15th and 16th. The day before is a policy day, and so some of the cities that have actually put funds towards development are going to be there. So like New York and Madison and some of these that have actually done that. So we would be real excited if they wanted to put any, funds in that way. They also have created a loan loss reserve program that benefits minority and women-owned businesses, and they want to add us to that. So those are some things that I would say that are in the works. I think that one will likely happen. I think the procurement one will likely happen. If any funds would be towards cooperative development efforts, I'm not sure that that's real likely in the interim, but maybe down the line.
Since we have a few minutes, maybe we can collect the questions. So if everyone's uncomfortable with that, okay. First here, and then we'll just go across.
First, I want to say this is great stuff. My name's Stanley Heller with Promoting Enduring Peace, and we're going to use it in a conference at the end of the month in Bridgeport. It's about Green New Deal and eco-socialism and so on. Sunday the 28th, that's the commercial.
Nice.
I just want to talk briefly about some of the things that have been done with co-ops in Connecticut. There's a fellow named Jeremy Brecker who's written a book about the various efforts in Connecticut over the last, 20 or 30 years. And what has happened a lot is a factory will have a lot of trouble and is about to shut down, and then somebody has the idea of making it a co-op. And that has happened, 10, 15 times. it has worked for a couple of years, but I don't think any of them have survived for any long period of time. And part of it is because the industry is in bad shape, and that's why it was losing money in the first place. So that's one thing. Second is New Haven co-ops. Now, I was trying to think of the ones that existed. The Yale bookstore, Barnes & Noble, was a co-op, not under Barnes & Noble, but it was called the Yale Co-op. And that ended only about, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. I don't think it was much of a co-op in terms of, the students elected the board or something like that, but that did exist. Then there was a co-op of housing, trade unions in New Haven got together and they built a, I don't know, maybe 60 units of housing, apartments. And it doesn't exist anymore as a co-op, but it was there for a while. And then there was a grocery, and it started small, and then it got successful, and then it moved to another part of town. And I think the problem is sort of mostly was middle-class, dedicated people, and then it kind of faded away. So I'm sure there's other things that have been tried, but those are the things that come to mind. And my short question is, how many people are actually working in the co-ops now in Jackson and in Cincinnati?
There's about 30 to 35 right now. So we obviously want, like when he said maximum capacity 20,000, totally interested in heading in that direction. Wish it would happen much faster.
Right.
But what I would just quickly say though, but in all of our co-ops, so you're part of the network, but you also have a person from CUCI on every board who has one golden power, which is to like stop demutualization or them selling themselves off to anyone, because they're for intergenerational wealth building. So that's like one little, like the golden vote, the only extra power that the CUCI representative has.
And we have the same type of dynamic in ours, same type of structure.
Also, the book that Stan was mentioning is called Banded Together, Economic Democratization of the Brass Valley, and it covers all of these things from worker co-ops to housing co-ops to the very details of the organizing that went into it.
Banded together?
Banded. Banded.
Like when did it come out? I've never heard of it.
2008, I want to say.
Yeah, okay. That's a
Kind
good
of
Cool.
20, 30 year history.
That's neat.
Okay, here, we'll collect these 4 questions.
I have a pretty quick one. I work for a nonprofit that's been doing research about creating housing land trusts for a while. And some of the best potential parcels of land in New Haven to do this, some large pieces that could have a big impact on community, are brownfields. Have you purchased any serious brownfields, and I'm wondering if you have how you figured out how to finance their cleanup and create affordable housing?
Okay.
Yeah, hi, I'm Anthony. I run a nonprofit here in New Haven called The Tipping Point that's focused on accelerating New Haven's transition to a just and regenerative economy. And worker cooperatives are obviously a part of that vision. And so, I have a lot of questions for you, but the one that I'll choose is, goes to the beginning, sort of the genesis of a single worker cooperative. And it goes to how do you create this space to get people engaged from that middle section who maybe they don't have time because they're like lower income or they're a single parent, they have 3 kids, something like that. How do you create that space for them to get engaged? And then, once you have the most number of people engaged, how do you, then obviously not all of them can become employees and worker owners right off the bat, so how do you then move from that point into, here's the group that's going to
Gotcha. Brownfields?
Quick question about whether you're working with community development finance institutions in your...
Definitely.
Yeah. My question is actually more for people in the audience, but I'd love to get your response on this. It really has to do with the fact that it goes back to Stan's question about cooperativizing unsuccessful, dying industry. In New Haven, in Fairhaven, there is a company called Pispoli, They make the crew vote. And the owner, when he retired, reorganized the organization and basically made stock, I believe, and offered it to the people who work there, who now own the company. It's a worldwide successful company, 35 people, mainly hands-on making these crew votes. And so my question to people in the audience is, how many people know that we have this example right here in New Haven? It is only 35 employees, but it's
significant.
Yeah, that's very significant.
Model, particularly since we have a philanthropic institution, right, in the work, the Community Foundation,
Yeah.
that is interested in inclusive growth. How do we buy the small to medium-sized businesses that are successful rather than trying to breathe air into something that's dying? And that's, so that's kind of like for anyone in the audience.
I think I got all four of them real quick. So brownfield development, we have never done that. One of our partners that we work with, though, that is creating net zero houses on a brownfield right now, has done that and accessed all sort of different funding streams from our city to our county to our state, and I'd be happy to directly connect you to that group if you want. They're a nonprofit. To your question about how when people have so much on their plate, so you get them involved, I mean, I don't know how to, like, I'm trying to think about this, but so I think in part it's like meeting, so every Sunday I meet with this group of 13 or 14 Guatemalan immigrants. They all live in this 300 apartment housing complex, so I go to their housing complex, we meet in one of the apartments, kids come, like it's like, and that's how, and we've been doing this every week, so people are just making the time for it because they want some different options. Because like you said, hungry. People are so deeply, 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 deeply hungry, I think. And so I'm going to their place, I'm meeting on a Sunday afternoon. So I think in part it's trying to accommodate schedules, but also I think when there's a huge hunger, there's like a willingness. So that's, I don't know, a partial answer. I'm trying to be really fast. So community development financial institutions all day long. Like so first of all, the working world that we talked about, they are a CDFI at this time, and so our loan fund is directly through them. But in terms of the Apple Street Market Project, working with Cincinnati Development Fund, which is a CDFI, they were the ones that allocated the new market tax credits to us. They're serious, serious partners, but everyone we've ever gotten financing from, Shared Capital Cooperative, another CDFI, the Ohio Finance Fund, another CDFI, into financing our co-ops. They're like massively important because most banks won't go near co-ops, especially in the startup phase. I think that I have more hope for the transitions. And to your question, I love it. I don't know how well known it is here, but that's a phenomenally exciting example. In terms of, it's true. It's like a co-op is not going to be a panacea to revitalize a dying industry. It can't be, so you have to really check out the feasibility of it. But there are an incredible amount of feasible, viable businesses around, and there are so many neat examples of how to respond to this crisis. New York just started this really cool thing, the state of New York, where they pulled together all of these different folks around the whole state of New York, where they're going to be developing pipelines of these potential folks, and they have all of this technical advisory capacity to help this transition. It's called Center for Transitions, I think. And then there's Massachusetts just this week, I think, refunded their employee ownership efforts, and they've highlighted that. I mean, where I'm from, the Ohio Employee Ownership Center is outstanding at this work. And there's all kinds of examples. We do it. The first thing we do is assess the viability of the company because we care. We don't want workers to have a bad deal. There's so many examples, and it's a phenomenal way. And if we would love. And the really interesting thing about the working world is when you create your own loan fund, you can bring money into it and then utilize it for whatever purpose you want. So you could create. Like, for example, if there was a New Haven group here, totally, really interesting, of all these different constituents interested in creating a cooperative ecosystem, and you all created a fund, say, with the working world, you're able then, community foundations can invest in that. It can be dedicated towards helping enable transitions of these kinds of businesses. I mean, and you have total control over it. It's awesome.
The Cooperative Fund of New England also does exactly the same thing. It's
Right.
been doing it for 20 40 years. And
That's
so
right.
They're
They're
in our
awesome.
neighborhood, so.
Yeah, no, they're seriously awesome, and I forget about them because they don't help outside of New England.
Right.
But they are rock stars, and you're in New England, so good luck. Yeah.
Just going quickly, we very intentionally try to stay away from brownfields in our context, just because of how HUD relates to the city in particular. Just has not been that helpful. And then since ours is very strategically kind of neighborhood based, there aren't that many in our neighborhood. There's some we have our eye on, and there's a process that we're looking to do that. But actually, in this case, the ones we have our eye on will be used for expanded industrial production. It wouldn't be used for housing. So it'll be a slightly different question of how do you do the remediation and why, right? I don't have much to add on the other point from Kirsten. I mean, I think the detailed answers, the meat that you want would have to be more of a long-term exchange, so you can hit me up, whenever we can build on that. I think that'll be the most just way to share our experience. We exist in a different, I wish we had the infrastructure Ohio had, or the infrastructure you all have here in the New England area. We don't have that infrastructure there. So for us, it's a great deal of, most of our stuff is either self-financed or it's been through like donor cultivation and some kind of, huh?
Do you work with Hope Credit
Hope is the
Union
only one that we can
and
work with.
Enterprise?
Hope is the only one that we do all our banking, everything with Hope. That's something that is it, right?
Yeah.
But it's limited in terms of what else we could really appeal to, and Hope has some limitations of itself, right? So it's not like we don't want to. It's just I have a thing. I'm not going to send my people someplace where I know they're going to get rejected, right? And in our community, it's like some places ain't even worth knocking on that door. Because you already know what the answer is going to be, and you can have everything lined up. You have all the equity that they want, everything. They just ain't going to give it to us. So for us, it's kind of like and it's not like ignorance. We've seen people have gone down that path in our environment before, and it's like the doors just don't open. So it's based upon knowledge. It ain't based upon speculation. It's based upon knowledge. And then really the last piece, I think there's more to this conversion piece that we have to look into. I think there are certain industries we want to die.
Yeah.
Right? And I think we need to be clear on that. There's certain things we just yes, let's put that to bed, let's bury it and leave it be. But then there are some things I think that it's a question of how can it be repurposed to serve a different use. And I think that's where in some of these things that are being converted over or looking at, it's like what's the thinking, and then what is the patience of particularly the financial forces that we're working with to understand, what it's going to take to transition this from one kind of utilization to another kind of utilization, and how long it would take for that to mature and grow. And I think one of the things about the working world, this kind of notion of the patient capital, and that's a critical thing that I think we need to move both ourselves and the financial forces that we're working with to kind of understand, because I think a lot of these conversions may not take, but it may take them 5 or 10 years to reach profitability. But are folks willing to wait that long in terms of seeing a return on your investment? That's a different question. So it's not like some of these things just falter because they're in some dying industries. A lot of them do, but there's some, if they want to think about moving in another niche, there's plenty of things that some things can be utilized for, but are we patient enough to deal with that? And then there's a question of, I think too much, one of the things that I see is there's still too much even when collectives get together, it's like a collective of individuals thinking about an individual industry, not thinking about an ecosystem that you need to survive, right? And re-articulate your economy on a local level. So I always encourage people, you to the greatest extent possible, with all the constraints, think about the ecosystem that you need in New Haven, not just like individual businesses and how they might grow, but like how does this ecosystem reinforce itself?
One comment on Vispoli before we wrap up. Vispoli is, I believe, 100% employee stock ownership plan in ESOP. So it's a little different than a worker co-op, or very different in a lot of ways, but limited voting rights for workers, but it's still an employee-owned firm with about like 40% market share nationally in raising vote shells. Also, another ESOP, prominent ESOP here is on Chapel Street. It's an arts and crafts store. I forget the name, but that's one other one.
Artists and craft rights.
Yes, that's also an ESOP. I'm not sure if there are other ESOPs in the area, but those to my knowledge are the most prominent ones. With that, thank
Please take some pizza to go. Thank you. This was really wonderful.
What you're doing now. I know what you're doing. I'm like, wow. I'd love to know more.
Yeah, absolutely.